Right. Who has amazing relationships with their suppliers in the sense that they would say full adoption and full utilization and engagement? Hands up. Very few. No, I appreciate that, and I suppose not a surprise from the previous conversation we had as well. So to shed some light over new concepts that are emerging around how to drive this engagement and adoption, I am pleased to welcome on the stage Anthony Payne, Chief Marketing Officer of HICX.
Thank you ever so much, Ragnar, and thank you to the previous speakers. Pleasure to be here. Actually, my intro spends quite a little bit of time talking about a problem that has been really relentlessly and thoroughly addressed this morning as well. So I'm going to set the scene very briefly, but then I'm going to get into the meat of the topic around supplier marketing pretty quickly. So I think it's fair to say that while we do have an adoption and engagement challenge, at the start of the relationship, things are pretty good. Your supplier is obviously highly incentivized to work with you. The brands in this room are phenomenal. Who wouldn't want to be a supplier of them? We'd love to be a supplier of all of them. So getting to that first purchase order, getting to that delivery of the first service or piece of software or product, that was a Freudian slip there, and getting to payment is what, of course, the suppliers are after. From a supplier's perspective, from that point onwards, they'd love to move into a steady state. And from a supplier's perspective, steady state looks something like this: transactions. Please send me POs. Please invite me to new tenders. I'll do what you ask. I'll send you product. You pay me. Life is great. From the customer's perspective, steady state, from your perspective, doesn't look like that. You have the transaction backbone. You have that continuous flow. But as we've established, I think, pretty thoroughly this morning, there's an awful lot more that goes on around that transaction. There's requests for compliance information, quality information, performance scorecards, tax information, sustainability, carbon reduction. You all know this, and you all know it 10 times better than I do. So steady state for you is not just transactions. It's an awful lot more. We do, of course, live in a digital age, and this is a tiny bit small here probably for you, apologies, but this represents the fact that these initiatives that you're deploying also usually come with new technology, and you're also making changes to processes. And you're doing that for good reason. You want to be more efficient. We've been talking about this morning already. You want to automate. And new technology, whether it's extensions of P2P or ERP, or hopefully additions of technology in the sort of best-of-breed landscape, you're adding more. And these two examples here are of customers or companies we've spoken to looking at the value chain and the different applications involved. So this is also a reality. So actually steady state for your supplier is those transactions going backwards and forwards. Requests for a whole bunch of information on a continuous basis. It's not just one time, as we know. It's renewals or updating the information, and Ruth just referred to getting to a point where you can close your books on carbon emissions every month. But it's also technology. It's also processes. And guess what? While you probably want to be their most important client, the chances are you're not their only client. So this is, I think, entirely consistent with what Eloise was talking about this morning. The reality of steady state for your suppliers is an awful lot of information requests, an awful lot of changes. And that leads to something that, actually, Eloise in the past has talked about survey fatigue, but we talk about initiative fatigue. Your suppliers are badly suffering from initiative fatigue. I think the reality is, I mean, the vision that Eloise paints is terrific, and we are heading in that direction, but as she says, we have perhaps a few years. These initiatives aren't going to go away. So what we need to think about is how can we increase adoption and engagement. How do we increase and get adoption of those systems and engagement of your suppliers in all of these initiatives? So that's the intro, as I say, which I think is kind of supports what we've discussed this morning already, or this afternoon already. But I wanted to try and look at that, or we wanted to talk about this through a slightly different lens. Full disclosure, I am a marketer, so apologies there. But we've come up with this idea or this concept through talking to a lot of companies and thinking about what they're trying to do. And there are very, very obvious parallels with how marketers think. So before the coffee break for about 15 minutes, I want to just talk about some of those parallels. And the idea is really to just get your creative juices flowing, your sort of thoughts going on how we can employ some of the tactics that exist in another part of your business, the marketing department, and how that can help you with this thorny issue of engagement and adoption. At the heart of this change, or this way of thinking perhaps, is the fact that your suppliers have a choice. Now, you're the customer, they're the supplier. In the end, you get to dictate to a certain extent. I'm not suggesting that somehow that we're all sort of equal in the power relationship. But your suppliers now, actually by their behavior, because there's so much going on, they do get to exercise that choice through what you might call a pocket veto. Maybe they're a little slow to reply to that email. Maybe they're not able to provide all of the information you need. Maybe they do log into that system, but they just do it once. So that you can tick the box and they know it's completed. So your suppliers are able to effectively to exercise choice, and it's this choice that is actually absolutely central. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not the case that your suppliers want to be difficult. You're their customer, you work for amazing brands, they want to be helpful, they want to take part, they want to use these systems as much as possible. But as a consequence of this noise, of all this activity across their customer base, it's just really difficult. Now that concept of choice is, funnily enough, exactly what marketers deal with. I would love to be able to require you to buy HICX software. I'd love to be able to require an audience to come to an event like this, or to read a piece of content we create, or attend a webinar we create. But patently, that's absurd. I can't insist or require. So as a consequence of that, marketers have to think differently. We have to think a little bit more about persuasion and encouragement, but much more importantly, and it isn't some black art, at the core of it is understanding how do we talk to you or our audience in terms of value? How do we explain to you and articulate to you and help you understand what we perceive is the value you will derive? And if we articulate that to you, then you'll choose to take the actions we want to. And I think a good way to kind of just sort of demonstrate that is actually to take a nice broad definition of marketing. This is a famous, or sort of one of the fathers of modern marketing, a chap called Philip Kotler. And his definition of marketing is the process by which companies engage customers, build strong customer relationships, and create customer value in order to capture value from customers in return. So you'll see 3/4 of that definition is nothing about getting them to buy stuff. 3/4 of it is all about how do we appeal to the supplier, to the customer in a way that's going to cause us to get value at the end of it. And with a sleight of hand, if we replace one word or a single word with another throughout this definition, we get what I think is a really useful way of thinking about supplier marketing. The process by which companies engage suppliers, build strong supplier relationships, and create supplier value in order to capture value from suppliers in return. So we think there's a lot in marketing that can be used here. And the value that you get from suppliers that's in that very last sentence, think of that as an action that you want your supplier to take. The value is they do complete that client compliance questionnaire. They do take part in that performance scorecard. They are part of that quality program. They do log into and continue to use those systems. That's the value you want. So use the first part of this definition to get it. So that's the thesis. Let's have a look at some of these things in practice. So in the next, say, 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to introduce a really simple concept or framework for how marketers think about campaigns. It won't be a big, long marketing lesson, trust me, you don't want one of those, but just a simple framework. I'm then going to think about how we can use that same framework in the world of procurement and supply chain in order to drive up adoption and engagement. And then I'll finish up with 6 simple suggestions, which I think could be the basis for going forwards when you leave here and go back to your organization. So this is the framework. It's real simple. It's got 3 things because everything in marketing is 3. Marketing joke. It is arranged this way deliberately. Each of the items on here is interdependent on the other. We have audience, we have the message, and we have the channels. There's no point thinking about what message I want to deliver if I don't know who I'm delivering that message to. Equally, there's no point thinking about a message and not thinking about which channel I'm going to pass it down. So for example, if my message is, drink this breakfast yogurt drink, it's delicious. If my channel is a TV slot at 6 p.m. in the evening, it's probably not that helpful. But if my challenge is handing out bottles of yogurt to busy commuters at a railway station as they run past at 8 o'clock in the morning, that's a much more effective channel, right? So there is a direct interplay between these 3. You cannot think about any of them in isolation. Let's take a moment to look at them, the 3 of them in a tiny bit more detail. Segmentation's been discussed a lot here, and as I was listening to the presentations, I was thinking, I hope I'm now not going to confuse the audience by talking about segmentation in a slightly different way, so bear with me for a second. Segmentation is essentially the first page of the marketing textbook. It's really everything we do has to start with segmentation. There's what, 8 billion people or something on the planet, however many million companies. Theoretically, what we would want everyone to buy everything, all of our product. Clearly not true, clearly not possible. So we think about segmentation by saying which is the subset of the global market that is best suited to the offer, the product, whatever it is we want the audience to do. And then we think about what are the characteristics of that segment that are most relevant that I'm going to use to build messaging. I'm not going to explain the theory any more than that. We'll talk about it in an example. So that's segmentation. That's the audience. Who is it I'm going after and being highly specific about it. Then we think about message, and you can also think about message as perhaps the action you want your audience to take, or what is it you're trying to tell them. Maybe it's an offer, maybe it's a buy one, get one free. But think of it as about what is it you want them to do and how are you telling them that. And then thirdly, the channel, which is very simply, am I going to get that message to them, to that audience? So it's just the mechanism to do so. Let's look at one real quick example from the marketing world before we leap over into procurement and supply chain, and I hope you can see the parallels. Xero is a small business accounting package, which 10 years ago was nothing, is now a market leader in a lot of territories. This is an advert that was running on the London Underground, for example. If we look at each of the three elements to this advert very, very quickly, just to help articulate, the audience is small business owners. Xero did something quite interesting, actually. Before Xero, accounting software was sold to accountants, unsurprisingly. And then the accountants would run the books for small businesses. These are companies unlike yours. They don't have finance teams. They would outsource their accounting to accountants. So accountant software was never sold to businesses for the most part at that end of the spectrum. Xero specifically changed that. We want to sell directly to small businesses. As a consequence of that change, their message then changes. Rather than talking in accountant speak about efficiency and staying up to date with tax regulations, which is really important, they talk about how Xero can help your business grow and how Xero can help you get paid quicker, which in the end are the two things any small business owner cares about above all things. So they understand their audience, and then they think about a message that's going to appeal to that audience, not to an adjacent or separate audience, but specifically to that audience. And then in terms of channels, as it happens, this was on the London Underground, but I'm sure this campaign ran across multiple channels. Xero is an incredibly well-funded and very successful business, so they will have delivered that same message and variations of it across dozens of channels, digital, online, offline, as much as you can imagine. Probably they didn't spend a lot of time going after the financial press, because most small business owners don't read Accounting Monthly or Accounting Weekly. They tend to go for information elsewhere. So here endeth the marketing lesson. For those of you thinking of a career change, I hope that was beneficial. But what I more hope is that you can understand that simple framework. And now let's have a think about how that might be applied. Now, to do that, I want to look at essentially the two broad use cases that we've been talking about this afternoon already. So on the one hand, we have the need to get data requests or data requests you have to your suppliers. And on the other, we have, or the second case is adoption of a new tool. So when we think about the audience, I think segmentation of principle is actually perfect. Thank you. Is actually really obvious as a concept. Clearly, you're not going to sell everything to everybody. It makes a ton of sense. So as an idea, I don't think it's very difficult. But what I think we need to start thinking about is how can we get closer to what marketers call hyper-segmentation, but you can think of in terms of segments of one. What do I mean by that? You've got 1,000 suppliers, as Eloise suggested, that would be part of your more active programs, and you've got 500 initiatives across your business, which is the kind of order of magnitude I think we're talking about. The chances are any individual supplier has a unique combination of initiatives, particularly also when you think about timing, a unique combination of initiatives just for them. If we can get to a point where any given supplier gets all of the initiatives specific to them, but only the initiatives specific to them, then you're removing all of the noise and a great deal of friction, and the chances are their willingness and their ability, more importantly, to respond to those requests increases. They know if they get a request from you, it's one that matters, it's no debate, and I've got to take part. So segmentation is about how do I identify supplier by supplier which of the initiatives, and the same applies to tools, I need to take part in. When we think about the message, we need to think about what's the value for the supplier. So I tried to articulate that when I was talking about Xero. They were thinking about their audience, which was small business owners. and growing your business and getting paid faster. So what's in it for your supplier? I know, again, it seems really obvious, but if we can try to change our language away from we need you to do this because to it would be beneficial to you to do this because, then I think we're going to get a much better outcome. So for example, if you're asking for scope 3 emissions type information, and this is the first time the suppliers had to do it, and it's difficult, it's hard work, they need to invest some time in it. Why not articulate that once they've done it for you, that's then available for all of their other customers, and that actually might make them, at the very least, more helpful to their other customers, but potentially a tiny bit more competitive as well. So let's think about the messages that appeal to suppliers. You can also think about what help you can provide your suppliers. Some of your suppliers are just as big as you are and maybe even more sophisticated when it comes to that same sustainability initiative. Others, rather less so, they maybe need help. So maybe we can segment into those and they can self-identify as who needs it, who doesn't, who need help. And maybe we can put in programs to help them fill in that information. There's plenty of online materials and learning content that can be created and delivered. So how can we help them actually deliver on your requests? And then, again, as part of the message, in an ideal world, you want to identify mutual goals, mutual benefits. Right? The completion of that initiative, sending in that data to you, the participation in even a performance initiative should ideally be beneficial to both parties. But you know what? Sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes you need it, and it's just a pain for them. So at that point, why don't we start thinking about some different types of incentive? What is it? It may not be necessarily automatically linked in your eyes or the supplier's eyes, but what is it you can do for the supplier that they do value? Would you even start to consider, if this stuff is that important, adjustments to payment terms? Maybe you're not going to be quite so tough on discount negotiation. Maybe you would give up a tiny bit of price, or maybe be willing to commit to a slightly longer contract. These are the things that your suppliers care about. You need them to do this. They want that. By using these as incentives to get them to what you need, maybe you can start to push up engagement rate. And then when we think about channels, look, I'm not suggesting we invent some new channel of communication, or that you use TikTok or Snapchat or until I have a teenage daughter. But email, you're going to keep using emails, there's no question about it. But marketers don't just send one email. Goodness, do we not send one email? We think in terms of email sequences. And the way we think about it is we're telling a story across several emails. And what we're trying to do is hit a different value point in each one in the hope that the recipient of that email resonates with at least one of them and then takes the action. Now, I'm not saying suddenly invest in an email marketing tool and spam your suppliers to kingdom come. What I am suggesting is start to be more considered. Don't just think, I need a form filled, send, fill the damn form. And then, well, I've sent the email, why aren't they doing it? Right? Quelle surprise, you're getting 11% open rates and 4% fill rates. Start to use email a little bit more thoughtfully. Think about sequences. Think about the stories you're telling, or the message you're giving them, and you might see a better outcome. It also doesn't just have to be written word. Loom is an incredibly powerful, simple video recording tool. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's kind of like Snapchat for adults. You can record little short videos, get your product teams or your buyers or your category teams for a small segment of suppliers to send a personalized or semi-personalized, to a group of suppliers. This is why I need this. This is why it's important. This is why it matters to you. Help us out. That kind of message might be more powerful than just another flipping email that they're going to file carefully. And then what about telemarketing? Maybe it sounds preposterous. Hang on, I'm going to employ a bank of people to call my suppliers to tell them to do something they really have to do anyway. If it's that important to you, if you think about the impact of some of these initiatives on your businesses, maybe it is worth it. Maybe it is worth it. Telemarketing is not as expensive as you might think it is. And maybe it's worth investing in that way. Not for everything. I'm not saying call every supplier for every initiative, but maybe if you use it selectively as part of an overall campaign, it might be beneficial. So that's supplier data requests. Before I wrap up with 6 recommendations, let's have a quick look at tool adoption using the same basic structure. Again, segmentation is fairly straightforward in principle. Most things in marketing are. It's not rocket science. It's all about the application. I'm sure you're not automatically going to send requests to join a new tool to suppliers who are not allowed to use it. That would be insane, right? So you're probably already saying if I've got an e-invoicing tool for this set of suppliers, they're the only people that get invited to log in. That's kind of a given. But maybe you need to think about prioritizing based on impact. Are there 20% of the suppliers responsible for 80% of the invoices? get those on board first. But not only get them on board first, but think about the campaign for those. Maybe it's in your interest to spend more on that campaign. Maybe that's the campaign for telemarketing, right? If you're saving $50 an invoice once you've got them onto a solution, and they, send you 100 invoices a month, my math is nowhere near quick enough. That's a lot of money to carve out of which a small campaign of telemarketing to walk them through logging on and using the blessed tool, right? They probably want to anyway, but if they're not responding to the email, it's worth it for you, it's worth it for them. So we can think about segmenting based on your priority and then deploying that segmentation across different messages. Maybe you need to think about job roles. If all of the emails that you're sending asking your suppliers to take part in initiatives or adopt new tools are going to help@suppliername.com, your open rates are probably not great. And if everything's going to accounts receivable at suppliername.com, because in the end that's the one that's probably kept up to date and manned, if the person in finance or AR that's receiving that is uninterested, too busy, got 10,000 other emails to deal with, your request is just going to be ignored. It's not surprising if you think about it. Now, I know this has a data requirement, but if your supplier database can have or holds information about who the account contacts are, the finance contacts, the quality, the product, the account team, if you have that information, use that information to direct your messages. We do this stuff all the time. We know exactly the job based on job titles. LinkedIn's a goldmine. And we're highly targeted about emails, believe it or not. We don't just send stuff out. And we can measure engagement rates very, very clearly from the generic to the targeted. It just goes up. It's so obvious to us as marketers, and I think the same principle can be very readily applied in a procurement environment. I've already talked a little bit about defining the value message in the supplier's terms, but if you can articulate why that tool is in their interest to adopt, how it saves them time, gets them paid quicker, which is kind of an obvious one, enables them to do better forecasting or planning, then the chances of them going and having a nose around and seeing whether it's worth their time is much higher than if you tell them, you're part of a program, you're in our gold tier program, we need you to log into this tool. Really, another one? So articulate it in their terms and you stand a much better chance of success. And use personas in the same way, right? If that message is targeted at the particular individual who's going to benefit most from that tool, again, the chance of them having a look, I think, will go up significantly. And then in terms of channels, the same as on the last page, quite honestly, because there isn't, again, rocket science here. But if you have existing tools that your suppliers are logging into, do you have the ability to interrupt their workflow with a quick message, say, hey, did you know we have also? Do it carefully, because people don't like being interrupted when they're trying to get something done. But it is a perfectly normal way, you'll know it in your consumer environment. Have you updated your address recently? Give them a really quick, easy way to do it, and they're much more likely to take that step. Send them a separate email, and they have to log in. Remember the password login is much, much harder. So we call those in-app notifications, extremely effective when you get it right. And then the final quick point before I go to those tips is, Eloise, I think, well, definitely Eloise talked about those supplier sites where she goes to a website and looks at the supplier pages. Those are, they're not loved, those pages, are they? They're updated with sort of fanfare and glory on day one, but they're probably not maintained as much as you would like them to be. And I suspect that's because it's actually really difficult within your organizations to get changes to those. Kind of who owns them? I know as a marketer, my interest in looking after the supplier-facing site would be quite low on the priority. So your marketing team probably feels the same. And I imagine your IT team does as well. There's just a whole separate product conversation about how we can change that, but that's not for right now. But if that site was segmented such that when your suppliers logged in, the content they received was only for them, because you knew they were a direct supplier in Latin America, and therefore all these policies and all these tools completely irrelevant to them, but only these ones are, and the welcome message was in Spanish or Portuguese as required, and it was highly specific to them, then their willingness to listen to that message, and in this case adopt the tool, might increase significantly. If it's all in English, it hasn't been updated since 2014, and it's very obviously unloved, they'll go once and never again. Thinking about how you segment the content you put on your supplier-facing website can be very beneficial. Righty-ho, last slide before coffee break. 6 recommendations. This was alluded to earlier, but I think is obvious. And I think is obvious, but I think bears repeating, is experience the process that your suppliers are going through, right? Actually send yourself the email to fill in the form and see, has it got 70 questions and only 6 of them apply to me? In which case, whittle it down, right? Yes, it's work, but do you care about these fill rates? Do you care about suppliers adopting these tools and getting a return on the very large investment you've made? If so, I think that work up front makes sense. Go through the adoption process on a piece of software. If it involves 40 steps and desperately difficult password combinations, while they are important, we've been talking about cybersecurity, just reconsider if that's necessary and consider what it is you're asking the supplier to do. But you don't know if you don't actually walk a mile in their shoes, as the cliche goes. I've talked a lot about segmentation. It had to be on this slide, and just in case someone took a photo, someone did, so I'm happy. Segmentation is where you start. Divide your suppliers up based on what their common characteristics are. Start there with everything. Be supplier-centric. So marketers talk about being customer-centric. So the opposite of customer-centric is, I've got a new portal tool and it's really good, and these are all its features. Being customer-centric means, if you use these features, this is how your life is going to be better. Make more money, save more money, be compliant. The same principle applies when we're thinking about suppliers. Being me-centric, the buyer-centric, if you like, is telling you, I need this done because we have an initiative to get to net zero by 2040. Being supplier-centric is, maybe it talks about the planet, but maybe it talks about, if you're also net zero by 2040, you're more competitive, you're more able to trumpet where you are. So think about what matters to them and make that your lead message. Resist all temptations, frankly, to talk about what's in it for you. They're your supplier. They want to help. They're going to anyway in the end, but you can get a much quicker, much better adoption, much better engagement if you just think in terms of what matters to them and just park what matters to you. It just doesn't matter in that email or that communication. It would not be a HICX presentation if I didn't mention supplier data. It is unquestionably true that the better quality your supplier data is, the more accurate, the more current, and the more granular, and especially as we're thinking about contacts within the supplier organizations, this stuff becomes an awful lot easier. Every marketer in the world complains about how appalling their customer and their prospect database is. So I'm not for a moment suggesting perfection in a marketing world is achievable. I think you can get a lot closer to perfection in the supplier data world. Our customers do. Focusing on data will make engagement and adoption much easier because you know who you're emailing, you know who you're contacting, and you know what matters to them. Think in terms of campaigns. I've talked a little bit about that point, so I shall not labor it further, except to say, don't just send one email and hope that's enough. Think in terms of a campaign as, what are we trying to achieve? Then those 3 things, message, audience, and channels, and then measuring it so that you can do it better next time. And then finally, my parting thought. If low fill rates and adoption are okay, and actually a quick segue before I get onto that, I was talking to an organization, a very large CPG EMEA manufacturer the other day. They have a target to get to carbon reductions of 35% reduced by 2030, net zero by 2040. They have identified that more than 85%, I think it was over 90% actually, of their emissions are scope 3. In other words, it's their suppliers. Right? They have absolutely no chance whatsoever to achieve those targets unless their suppliers work with them, unless their suppliers provide information, unless their suppliers make changes. They have 85 different initiatives. I'm sure this resonates with some of you. 85 different initiatives that they're running across their supplier base in order to hit these targets. And this is a very big company you will all be highly familiar with, and this is in their AGM, in their board level content, in their annual reports, their commitment to get to net zero. Like, is this important enough? It kind of feels like it is. Does it make sense to start thinking about a supplier marketing team, and maybe having some kind of service provision to the rest of the organization? If your legal team wants a new contract management tool adopted, if your compliance team needs this questionnaire completed, if your product team wants a performance assessment done, maybe they go to the supplier marketing team and they say, right, what are you trying to get done? Let's think about audience, channels, and message, and then let's measure it, and then we can do it better next time. If this stuff's important enough to you, maybe we need to start thinking about resourcing it as well as changing how we do it. So with that, I shall say thank you very much.